G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and in this episode of Rings of Power, I want to talk about how it doesn't understand the source material. Now with a title like that, I can only imagine that in the comments there's going to be a lot of hate, but I'd like everyone who's stuck with this series so far to remember that we focus on the little story details and what the show could choose to portray but doesn't. And this is with the thought that it is an adaptation in mind, and yet somehow things end up missing that there's no reason to in such a broad scope of a TV show for these things to be missing. That's today's video in a nutshell, and talking once more about all these little ways in which Tolkien built his world, but the show just ignores them, when often they simply didn't need to. Well, that's what I want to talk about. So let's start at looking at the races of Middle-earth and how they're portrayed. Now, I don't want this video to turn to some conversation on ethnicity of the actors. That's irrelevant to the point I'm choosing to make here, so don't even go there. When you think back to the Hobbits, and you think of the little English people living in underground little hobbit holes in their idyllic little world, that's how Tolkien and Jackson portrayed them. When you think of Rohan, you think wide fields and open plains with wild grass and rocky outcrops, wooden buildings with thatched roofs. Gondor, land of white stone with slate rooftops, silver and black livery. Lorien, white flats in the treetops lit by the pale glow of lanterns. The world is positively ancient Middle Ages. The only transport there is your own 2 feet, a horse, or a sailing boat. Places are far apart, and travelling from somewhere like Hobbiton to Rivendell is several weeks of travel time in a straight line. Going from Hobbiton to Khazad-dûm is months. In this show, however, due to the way skin tones and cultures are mingled, there is no sense of that distance, because everyone looks the same regardless of where you go. Even elves, the elves of Lindon and Eriador, are identical. Yes, they're both Noldor elves, but the people of Eregion, they trade and intermingle with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. That would have an impact on their culture. You would be seeing dwarven travellers and goods flowing between the locations. Mordor and the Southlands. It's a vast distance away from other mannish cultures of the time, such as Numenor, and yet the people look basically the same as those of Numenor. If all the races are intermingled in this world, how does the audience intrinsically understand distance and the geography of the world the show is set in? A multicultural, multi-ethnic world is what we live in today's society, yes. But in a world like that, it makes no sense. Shouldn't a show that is doing that employ more people of the same skin tone in the same area and have different skin tones or different statures helping to portray different ethnicities? The Númenóreans are a race of high men, and they are taller, over a foot taller than their compatriots. They should be different, more imposing, to help demonstrate their thousands of years of isolation on their island and how different they've become. That brings me to a good point, which is one that I'm really sick of seeing, and that is the people who justify time skips. For those who think the endless time skips on the show are somehow a good thing and required, I'd like to point out that, well, just one alone, the many I have issue with, is going to be, well, Galadriel, for example. People say that, oh, well, it makes sense that she's a prick now because her personality growth, she's had thousands of years to change, so of course she's different to how we see her in Lord of the Rings. But for me, her personality growth, that was in the years of the trees in the First Age. I think after a couple of thousand years, the show, she's at least 3,000 years old by the time the show is set. Her personality should probably be starting to set itself in stone, okay? Versus when we see her in the Lord of the Rings. We have Numenor, of course, quite possibly my favourite faction in the Legendarium. The whole point of Numenor is that they rise over 1,000 years in isolation on their island. They are led by Elros, who's the brother of Elrond, who ruled them for almost 500 of those years. They were guided by the Valar in the creation of great works and had a land of peace and plenty. Without realising it, they actually became the strongest of the peoples of Arda, and when called upon to unleash their power, they realised for the first time just how strong they had become. The newfound understanding of their strength bred an arrogance, a hubris, which slowly overtakes their culture, and over time they begin to see themselves as superior, and taking advantage of the world around them rather than being a symbiotic part of that world. They wonder how it is that they, the tall men with long lives, who time and again have to keep getting involved in Middle-earth to save elves, to save humans, have to waste their noble blood and lives, whilst the elves get to live in eternal paradise without sickness or death. It's understandable how their jealousy and greed corrupts them. This cancer spreads not overnight like in the TV show, but through their society over 1,500 years until they reach the point of no return. This point in time is where the show is beginning, however, at the end of that stage. And it makes no sense to us because the people there are nowhere near xenophobic enough yet in the TV show. So to have them go from being a race of men who fought with the elves against darkness in the First Age to outright hating the elves and trying to seize their lands by force is a big stretch. It's a huge character building point for so much, and it's part of why Elendil and his line, and those that descend from him, that is so special, because they were the only men who resisted their culture heading down that dark road. We have other weird changes in the story which have snowballed to the point where Elrond, for example, says he was found orphaned and alone by Galadriel, when he and his twin brother Elros were actually rescued by the would-be killers of his mother, which were actually two of the sons of Feanor, who in a rare moment of humanity take the twins in and raise them amongst the elves until the end of the First Age, when Elrond joins his second cousin Gil-galad in the Havens of Valar. Not that Gil-galad treats Elrond like he's an actual close blood relative, he treats him as a nobody in the TV show. Galadriel says she's lost her husband, Celeborn, and I'm assuming this means lost as in she thinks he's dead but he'll turn out to be alive later. But by the time of the show, her husband, her daughter, Celebrian, who would later become Elrond's wife, are already living in Lorien, heading there when Celebrimbor arrives in Eregion. The show cannot show you these things though, and it will go out of its way to create dialogue to explain why someone isn't there, rather than show you these things or just ignoring these things, which is a really weird choice. In the film The Fellowship of the Ring, you don't hear them bring up Tom Bombadil at the Council of Elrond in order to explain to the audience why he isn't around, nor do they bring up Glorfindel. This could work, of course, in the TV show, if the show focused on exploring the crafting of the rings, but instead it's exploring so many different narratives and rushes to the finish line on the Elven rings. The show both takes forever and rushes it, which kills the pacing. We didn't need to know how Mordor turned from Southlands into Mordor. You just need to know there's a volcano there. You didn't need to know, for example, about what's happening with the Half-Foots and the wizard that they've found. It's irrelevant to the story at hand. You start small with a TV series in the first season, and you build up to bigger things. Instead, they're trying to start out with all these different plot threads at once, and it just doesn't work for me personally. Then, of course, we get to the Forging of the Rings, which is why they're on screen and have been this whole, episode. Now, it's a funny thing. Real life, I'm an engineer, and I know a thing or two about real-world metals and crafting. I watch the forging scenes in great confusion. Why? Well, because whilst the world isn't real that the show takes place in, some of the ground rules in that world are. The physics are the same as our world. Timber and stone behaves as it does here, and the underlying element of magic, which works in mostly soft ways, is the thing that differentiates Middle-earth from our world. So Halbrand's big advice to Celebrimbor, a thousands-of-year-old smith descended from the greatest elven craftsman that ever was or will be in Tolkien's work, his big advice to him is to try melting mithril with other metals in order to alloy them. And I have to ask, how the hell else was he trying to do it? He also mentions how nickel can be added to steel to improve its properties, and again, I have to wonder how this isn't known to the elf craftsman whose grandfather could literally trap light within crystal made by his own hands. Even in our world, nickel has been used for hundreds of years in steel crafting, so I'm pretty sure the Noldor, who had steel weapons and armour in the first age of the world, probably didn't need to be told about it. Nitpick? Sure. But there are so many other ways that they could have gone about this. Since Sauron is a demigod, perhaps show Celebrimbor how to infuse magic into metals. That would be better. But what would I know? I'm not the person writing the show. Instead, what we get is Celebrimbor taking a dagger with no flux, which is kind of important here, and he just melts it in a furnace. Then, after removing it from the forge, they drop the piece of mithril in it, and then they swirl it about and pour it into moulds to cast little ingots. These ingots are identical metal from the same source, and yet somehow yields 2 gold and 1 silver ring. I'm sorry, what? If you have an alloy of any metal and pour it into ingots, the ingots don't change colour. That's not how metallurgy works. The rings of power aren't powerful because of what they're made from. They are powerful because they are imbued with magic that amplifies the magical power of the user. Since the metal they are made from isn't important, there is no need to go through this bizarre display of crafting. It was designed, I suppose, for the layman, the person who doesn't understand Tolkien's world. You have to be told, these rings are special because they're made from alloying McGuthril into other things that came along. It doesn't make sense. I can only assume that Celebrimbor, before he was given the advice to melt the metal, was just hitting mithril ore on his anvil with a hammer to try and bond it to another metal somehow, which makes no sense. None of the show, therefore, is making sense to me, and it's infuriating because it didn't need to happen this way at all. All it needed was a montage of Sauron whispering in Celebrimbor's ear about how magical infusion would be far better. Mithril itself didn't need to be mined to save elf lives and thus awaken a Balrog. In fact, that's even more annoying because it's a total flip on the theme of mithril. The dwarves in the show are mining it to try and save lives. That's noble. That is a honest goal. But that's not Tolkien's summation of what mithril mining symbolised. In the books, what is the line? They even say it in the films. The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep.
The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep.
They mined it because they were greedy. The show subverts the themes of the actual work of Tolkien in favour of allegory. The allegory is holding up a torch to the modern world and modern politics. And I have news for you. Tolkien hated allegory. So with these many issues further delved into, I'm just going to end the video here before I stray too far on a tangent, because there's just hundreds of these little nitpicks I could bring up. Forging the rings and misportraying the themes of the original works just frustrates me, because why make an adaptation of a work if you don't intend to stay true to the original work? The only reason they're doing it is not because they had a genuine tale to be told in Middle-earth, but because they wanted people to have brand recognition that Lord of the Rings symbolises. This is Tolkien's work. You know Tolkien, therefore you'll come and watch our show and we'll make money. That's it. And that's just sad. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.